So, welcome. This is an intro that we actually filmed at the end, but I'm going to put it at the beginning. So, hi.
Because the first shall become last, and the last shall become first.
Welcome to Fireside Chat. We're still in our Immersed Bible series. We're on, the first full week of reading. I hope that you enjoyed the following tangents and talks we had while discussing the book of Luke and the Messiah series.
So, is there anything that jumped out that we should talk about? Or do we just talk about something else?
Something completely else.
Well, I restarted listening to Martin Buber's I and Thou, which I read like 5 years ago, back in high school. So I got it as an audiobook now, listening to it. And when I first read it, I didn't read the preface, which I realize now, at least in the translation I have, the preface by the translator is almost like 10% or like 15 to 20% of like the whole book.
Okay.
At least the copy I have. And he goes into some of his teachings, or like his philosophies and the history of Buber. And one of them I found really interesting. It's now giving me thought and pause. And that is the idea of... are you looking for it?
I'm looking for that, and I'm missing that book. I have it.
I bet you do.
Oh, I know I do, but it's not there.
Yeah, it's not that big either.
No, but it's not there. These are alphabetically.
I was just going to ask.
By author or
by author. Alphabetic by author, and so it's not there.
Yeah.
Which means I lent it to someone, or it's in a box still yet to be unpacked. So keep going. The thought
that... So he knows a lot about Christianity, even though he's like a Jewish philosopher. He knows a lot about a lot of religions. And he didn't go into this in the actual book of I and Thou, but in the preface where he's talking about other philosophies, is at one point Buber got in a conversation or a debate with a Christian about like the necessity of Christ's death, and the idea that the Gospels don't say that it was for the forgiveness of sins, that that's a Paul thing, and that if he just reads the Gospels, the sacrifice, the death of Christ, the crucifixion, could be for things other than just the forgiveness of sins. And he almost challenges that basic Christian reading of that Christ had to die to forgive sins, or that the sacrificial system was needed to forgive sins, demeans God's power. Because throughout Scripture, God forgives sins and forgives the sins of the people without the use of sacrifice. And then he points out, even when Christ was alive, he forgave sins, and it wasn't in the temple, it wasn't during the holy days, it wasn't during sacrifice. So even if you say, yes, he was using God's power to forgive sins, and he uses the example of the paraplegic man lowered through the roof by his friends, to say that, Christ forgave him, and he did not require sacrifice. And then he points to the Psalms and other passages of the prophets where it says, God doesn't delight in sacrifices, but God delights in like the contrite heart, the repentant person. So that's a very interesting read on that.
Yeah. So this is atonement, like the theories of atonement. What exactly was Christ's death for then? And as I think about the claim there comes to what my mind went to was I forgot.
Well, I think Buber isn't alone in suggesting other philosophies of why Christ would have died, besides just theories of atonement. I mean, Kierkegaard goes into different ideas of why Christ could die and it not just be about sins. More modern people like Zizek, the Ukrainian philosopher, goes into why Christ's death and the death of religion in general, but he still considers himself like a Christian and still believes in Christ, but Christ didn't die for forgiveness of sins in their philosophies either.
I get it. I remembered.
Okay, good.
So, the idea of power, that it demeans the power of God.
To require sacrifice.
To require a sacrifice. It almost lends to the idea that the evil one, Satan, Lucifer, whatever you want to call him, let's just call him the evil one, or even just evil in general. The idea of evil is somehow more powerful than God. So much so that it required or demanded a sacrifice to be atoned for, to substitute, right? So it's a substitutionary atonement. And what we say is that there was this somehow debt that the sacrifice of Jesus paid for, that our sin or our lives were a monetary transaction almost, and in that the bottom line of that means that the person that's getting paid, the debt is getting paid to, is somehow more powerful than the God of the universe that was the creator of all things, and therefore it needed some kind of substitutionary, so that we don't pay that debt. Now Jesus pays that debt. And even within our theological underpinnings of our church, we leave a lot of room for something other than that, because there isn't completely a strong case for that within the Gospels.
For sure.
And so there are other ways to view the work of Christ. Part of his humanity, probably the biggest miracle of Christ was that this was God in the flesh, right? Emmanuel, God with us. So it's not so much that Jesus was divine when he was on earth, it's that Jesus was human when he was on earth. That was the miracle. And so we then have a human that experiences what we experience, and all of us will experience death. So if for nothing else, Jesus's death allows us to know that he experienced what we've experienced, that he's gone to the pit where, like, not pit of hell, but to the depths of what our struggle will be, which ultimately ends with death, and then conquers that. And brings us away for resurrection, that it doesn't end with death, that there is something eternal, there's something beyond the grave, and in that it doesn't, you can have a theory of Jesus in that and it not at all diminish who he was. But Buber is probably, in my reckoning, right up there in a lot of my understandings of what it means for Jesus to forgive sins, because he's right. You think about any of the women or men that he healed in his lifetime, there was no, your sins are forgiven, and now you must pay this sacrifice, or now I've paid this sacrifice for you, or it's not transactionary.
Right, and the one time that Buber points out that Christ didn't demand a sacrifice, but told the gentleman to comply with the sacrificial laws, was when he healed the leper. He heals the leper, says, okay, you're going to be cleared of leprosy, your sins are forgiven, go forth and sin no more, but now go to the temple and offer the sacrifices, Scriptures in Luke, offer the sacrifices that are required of you by the law of Moses to show that you are now clean to the priests. But he doesn't do that as part of to forgive your sins. It was, to show yourself as clean, perform the sacrifice and show yourself to the priests.
So every single healing that we find in the book of Luke, if you pay attention to it, there is a communal restoration. Every single healing.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't a healing that he does that does not somehow restore the person beyond their physical problem, beyond their emotional problem, their psychological problem, whatever the problem is. There is a communal aspect to that healing.
Right.
And he tells them to go back, go to the people.
Because otherwise, especially with someone with leprosy, you'd been kept out of the community until the priest said you're clean.
Right. So it's not so much about go and do the right thing and do these sacrifices because I did this for you. You know, it's not because I did this, now you go do this. It is very much a restoration to the community. I think we see this most clearly with the woman who touched the hem of his garments. Yeah. And we see it most clearly with her because he could have kept walking. And he could have took the answer of, hey, wait, nobody did it. And he didn't. He said, no, wait, this power has flowed through me, and I know it. So who was it? And at the end of the day, that wasn't about condemning her for doing it. That wasn't about telling her she was wrong. It was absolutely so that she had the opportunity to share her story and to say, this is who I am. This is where I've been. This is how I've been treated. This is how my community has not accepted me. But then for her community to be able to say, you're healed. You don't have this uncleanliness that you had, especially since it was such a personal uncleanliness. How would she prove that to anyone? The question is, how did anybody know to begin with? Somebody's got a big mouth. But at the end of the day, every single healing that Jesus performed came with a communal restoration.
And then one of the things I've always loved about that story of the woman touching the hem of his cloak is that it's stuck in the middle of the healing of a kid whose dad comes and shows up. The keeper, I'm forgetting his name now, but he's the keeper of the temple. He's the keeper of the synagogue, and he comes to Jesus and says, "My kid is sick. Come heal him." Mm-hmm. You know, and Christ stopped in his tracks. So he's healing a very important person's kid, and he stops in his tracks and does this, which also then goes to that community feel, in my opinion, because he's doing this in the midst of community. He's going to heal a community leader's child, and he's doing it surrounded by people that are bumping into him. And he's, you know, there's a communal aspect even to this little story stuck in by a bigger story. Bookends it.
Yeah, and then the one before that is the story of Legion. So it's the one at the beginning is Legion. Mm-hmm. And again, even when Legion is healed, he's outside of his city. He's been outcasted.
Chained out to the graveyard.
Yeah, he's been outcasted because of the demons that are within him. And when this happens, what could have happened is he could have just left Legion there, but he didn't. The whole town, he tells them, now go back to your family and tell them everything that God has done for you. And then Jairus is Jairus, is the man that his daughters. So, the space of 3 stories of restoration. I actually picked up on something in the reading in that story. You go from Legion, who has this powerful story where even demons are shuddering, like even the demons in these that are sent into these pigs know who Jesus is. They sense the power, and you go from that, and then you have him being healed. He goes back to his community. You have Jairus come and say, hey, my daughter is dying. Please come. I mean, this man falls at the feet of Jesus, begging him to save his 12-year-old daughter. And so Jesus goes on his way. He's walking with him. He's heading there. This woman reaches out. And this episode happens. And he stops. And in the time that he stops and there's this restoration for this woman, because I'm sure it doesn't take like 2 seconds. We read it so quickly. Mm-hmm. But this is probably a prolonged story of people. I mean, just think about any story that happens. For the story that we tell, it's always longer. And in that time frame, this little girl dies. Mm-hmm. And
imagine being Jairus or Jairus. Like, imagine being him. Like, I'd be really frustrated by that woman.
Yeah.
Like, I'm getting this great teacher and this great miracle worker to come to my house and save my daughter.
Yeah.
And how frustrated it would be to have this random woman who I've probably removed from our community before, and she's working her way back in, and now she's holding up my man.
Yeah, she's holding up my daughter's healing, and then to find out that she, that while they're standing there speaking to her, a messenger arrives and says, hey, never mind, don't bother the teacher anymore, she's dead. And then Jesus just says, hey, don't be afraid, just have faith and she'll be healed. And I can't imagine how flippant that must sound in the middle of that kind of grief. For someone to just, who's lost their daughter, to say, hey, just have faith. Just have faith. In fact, we do that to a lot of people, but we're not Jesus. And so, anyways, he tells them this, and then they continue. Jesus walks this journey. I can't imagine the conversation. Or was it silent? Was there dead silence the whole way? But he continues to this man's house. And what I picked up on this is that they wouldn't let anyone go in. So Peter, James, and John, and the father and the mother go in, and the house, people are weeping and wailing, and hysterical. This little girl must have meant the world to a lot of people. And he tells them, stop weeping. In fact, he says, stop the weeping, right? Like, stop the weeping now. And she isn't dead, she's only asleep. And the crowd just laughed at him. So they go from this weeping to this laughter. And they all knew she had died, like as if they had all gone up and taken her pulse, or they had all seen her, touched her, something. They all knew she was dead, but they laugh at him. And then he takes her by the hand and he just says to her, my child, get up. And she was resurrected. Last week we talked about the many people that Jesus was resurrected before Jesus, that nobody ever talks about. Like, Jesus wasn't the first person to be resurrected. In Bible study. And in Bible study we did, And so her parents become overwhelmed, and then Jesus insisted that they not tell anyone what had happened. How, everybody there had to have known, but in this sense, there was this restoration within the community. But what I cued in on that was the sense of, are we sleeping? This resurrection power that isn't just in literal death, it's in the woman in that story, right? The power that went through her body, that went out and flowed out of his garments and flowed into her body, was resurrection power. The power that spoke the demons out of Legion was resurrection power. And so how often today are we like the little girl, where we're just asleep to that resurrection power in our life? And even Jairus in it, right? This place of have faith. You're walking blindly through it. We know enough, right? We know enough to go get the good teacher. But we don't know enough to know that there is this resurrection power that can utterly change everything. That was kind of my notes and my sidelines in that when I had read through it.
Makes you think of that parable of, the bridegroom goes away, and then the attendants are asleep. 5 are awake, they have the lamps ready, ready to go, and how much blessed they'll be when the bridegroom comes back. And the ones that are awake will be blessed, and the ones who aren't awake will be scrambling for oil.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a sense of, one of my mentors, Leonard Sweet, talks about...
We're dropping all the philosophers' names today.
Yeah. He talks about this need, like we have the society has this need for zombies, right? We're obsessed with death across the board. And any TV show that you're talking about, death, vampires, werewolves, zombies, murder, we are just obsessed with this idea of death. And we might think that it's this idea of death becoming, but the reality that we're already dead. Like, we're walking around so numb and so asleep to life that we're already zombies, and we're just desperate for some kind of infusion of resurrection and life. And I think this text in a way hits on it. The people who didn't understand the woman reaching out, the people who didn't understand anyone going for this power, like when they got it, they were drawn to it. But when they didn't get it, it was as if they were just sleeping. And I think it's a good question for us. Are Are we sleeping through what ought to be his resurrection power in our life? Are we somehow cutting it off or shortening it? And I think a lot of times, to get back to the idea of what was the death of Jesus for, I think that when we have that mentality that I am so evil, I am so bad, I am so worthless, all of my sins are unforgivable. Like when I feel like I am totally depraved and I am nothing, that makes sense. The idea that, oh, well, Jesus then makes me something makes sense. But it doesn't make sense when we think about what God said about us from the very beginning when he created us, right? That we were created in the very image of God, that we hold the sacred entity inside of us. And we're really good at being divine. At least we like to think we're gods. And but we're not very good at being human. And I think that ultimately the life of Jesus was to teach us how to be better, to teach us how to be more human, how to die well, and how to live well. And not so much about, I don't know, I refuse to reduce it to the entire existence of Jesus was simply for his death. I can't get there. I think there was something more to it. So wrestling with that book, which again we're talking about, I
and Thou.
Yeah, I and Thou by Martin Buber. Wrestling with that book is a good wrestle.
It's dense. It's short, but it's dense.
Mm-hmm. And I think we have to wrestle with things that we aren't used to or that we aren't familiar with, because it's the only place that our faith has the opportunity to transform and mature and become something more.
And as an aside, I think I've heard more quotes and stories of Jesus from the preface of the book, from the translator, and from the actual book itself than I feel like I do a lot of other theology books who spend so much time in Paul, convincing us, not saying that Paul is wrong, but just hammering down the minutia of what Paul says, and then leaving out the mystery of the Gospels, leaving out the mystery of Christ's life, that the variety of interpretation that someone like Buber, a German Jew from pre-war, can bring to it.
Yeah, and well, so there's a space of Paul as an author of the text, but so I remember one time a gentleman came up to me and told me that I preach too much Jesus and I should preach more Paul.
We've had people tell us we don't preach enough Jesus anyway.
And so, well, it's
right.
Like within a matter of a couple Sundays, one person can say you don't preach enough Jesus, and the other person can say you preach too much Jesus.
Right.
And but the space of we oftentimes within Western Christianity are not Christians. We're Paulians, and we put Paul. I made that up. Paulians. Paulians. I like Paulians better.
I still like calling the Muslims the Mohammedans.
Well,
I've always found that was fun.
We could just call us Paul bearers.
Ooh,
oh,
snap. That works in so many levels.
It works in many levels.
With the death
but
and all that.
yes. But either way, we are not. We are not. Paul himself talked to, like this whole, we haven't gotten there yet in our readings, but this whole idea of some follow Apollos and some follow Peter and some follow, like, no, we follow Jesus. And so I do not read the letters that Paul wrote to individualistic churches at the same level in which I read the gospel stories of Jesus Christ. I don't.
I feel like it would always be interesting to have some of the writings of Barnabas or the writings of Apollos.
Yeah,
the same way we have the writings of like James and
right.
Paul
They are
others.
great things for us to learn from, but they are not the same as the teachings of Jesus. They are a translation or an interpretation of the teachings of Jesus. They are holy. this again, that what I'm saying is not to diminish them or to say that it's not a sacred text, because I believe that it is. But how I read Paul is the best way to say it is that I do not read Jesus through the lens of Paul. I read Paul through the lens of Jesus. And the same thing is true of the Old Testament. I don't read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. I read Jesus through the lens of the Old Testament. There's a sequence to it, not so much chronological, but just a methodological sequence to it. And it's really hard to separate those things out. But as it is through Paul that we get the substitutionary atonement. It is through Paul that we get a lot of theories or conversations or interpretations of what it meant to be a Christian. And this is why if you read the text of Paul, a lot of times it seems, in fact it doesn't seem, sometimes it is outright contrary to one another, because he's talking to different communities about different things and about different circumstances. And the beauty of Paul is if you read it and you read it not so literal or not so, this is the only way to think about it. What the beauty of Paul is that he absolutely shows us there's a heck of a lot of gray in life. Mm-hmm. That life is not so black and white. And life, and if life is not black and white, there's no way God can be black and white. There's far more gray, 75 shades instead of, maybe a million shades of gray.
I like how, no joke, so you go to 50 Shades of Grey. In my mind, I went from, he went from Gandalf the White to Gandalf the Grey. That's where my mind went.
Oh, no.
And your mind goes to 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, I've never seen it or read it, so I don't know. But, that's truth. But but there's the life is, there is this space that is absolutely gray, and it's hard to live there, but I think that's there that we find humanity. It's there. I think that's ultimately where Jesus lived, was in the gray, not in the black and white.
And I think that lends itself then it lends itself to the philosophers and the theologians and the everyday just thinkers about life to interpret that gray and that black and white. Not to interpret the gray to sort out the black and white, but to interpret what that looks like. And part of that interpretation is to be human.
Yeah, but I wouldn't leave it to the philosophers and the theologians.
Well, no.
I would leave it leaves it to every single one of us to understand that life is not black and white, that there is a big fat gray in the middle of it, and that we have to live it with intentionality, that we have to live it with our whole being, right? What is the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and then to love your neighbor, right? It's the second. And if we don't with intentionality, right? If I sit and I leave my entire faith existence to the books that I have read or the sermons that I have heard or the Bible studies that I've participated in, and yet I've never wrestled with the gray in my own individual heart and mind, I'm missing something. I'm missing a part of what it means to be human. If I haven't wrestled with the big things of life, if I haven't questioned what is the meaning of life and everything in it, if I haven't sat down and struggled with death and suffering on my own, and I've just picked up my latest copy of Oswald Chamber and said, that's what he says about it, so that's what I believe about it. And if I've done that, I've done a disservice to myself. I know that's, in some ways you could argue I've done a disservice to the world. But it first starts with I've done a disservice to myself, because I haven't stepped into what it means to be fully human and to wrestle. Think about Jacob and his wrestling, right? It's okay to wrestle with God and to wrestle with these ideas of life and death and gray and black and white.
My stomach rumbling isn't being picked up on the microphone. That's all I hear. What were you saying?
I was just thinking of pious irreverence.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. I looked up an author of another book to make reference to, but I didn't look up that one. Do you remember who wrote that?
Dav Weiss.
I like ignorance. Yes, so another thick read that's very, like...
Not pages thick, but material thick.
Dense.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, dense.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Pious Irreverence. Pious Irreverence by Dav Weiss.
Yes.
Thank you. It was recommended to us by one of my religion professors at UT, and it chronicles the different views and interpretations of wrestling with God since Genesis through the Midrashes, through the Talmud, through the different sages over time, all the way up to today. And the book begins with a reference to the West Wing, like the 90s into the early 2000s TV show about the president. And it begins with a scene where he's in a cathedral after one of his closest friends dies all of a sudden in a car accident. And so he goes in there and he argues with God, like, why'd you do this? Is this some sick joke? And then, so he starts with that most modern interpretation of wrestling with God. And then it takes it all the way back to, well, what do we say about Lot? What do we say about Jacob? What do we say about Jeremiah and Moses and these other people who stood up and argued with God? And sometimes over histories of interpretation, we say, oh, they eventually get their comeuppance from arguing with God. Sometimes we say that, oh, that's good that they argue with God. Sometimes we say, oh, that was just a test. Sometimes we say it was a good, bad, otherwise. And this very dense, like, college research paper, kind of a book, chronicles the history of the interpretations of wrestling with God. It's really interesting.
Oh, that's a good one. I'll have to read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The, one of the things, to get back to that idea of communal restoration, and I think it all ties in this space of relational issues. I was struck, again, reading the text in this translation has been different. So different things jump out. And on page 35 of it, it says, I have come to set the world on fire. And I'm like, yes! This is perfect. And he says, I wish it were already burning. But this is the part of the text where he says, father will be divided against son, and son against father, and mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, and mother-in-law against... You know, he goes on this thing that they
come to bring the sword.
Right. And so he says this, then he says, so Jesus turns to the crowd and he says, when you see clouds beginning to form in the west, you say, here comes a shower. And you are right. When the south wind blows, you say, today will be a scorcher. And it is. You fools. You know how to interpret the weather signs of the earth and sky, but you don't know how to interpret the present times. And in that space, I don't think he's saying that his will... So where I got to in this, he isn't saying that it's his will that daughter be turned against mother and son be turned against father. That's not what he means when he says he's coming to set the world on fire. That's not at all what he means. But I think he was talking to a people who had gotten so thick in their religiosity that they knew what they knew, and they used the weather as an example, right? You know the weather like this. And okay, of course you're right in that, but you're applying those same ideas that you can understand the weather to something that's not meant to be understood that way. And because of that, you are going to break relationship with people. You are going to not understand your father. You are going to fight with your brother. You are going to fight with your mother because you've put this black and white box of things that can be absolutely defined when life isn't that. There are aspects of life and questions in life that we might never have the answer to, or the answer that I get might be different than the answer that you get. And what this led to for me was that this was just a relational thing, right? We cling to what we know over preservation of relationship. So we cling to what we know over it's important, right? So why do we have this question that Martin Buber is presenting about what does Jesus' death mean? We have this question because we think we need to know. We need to know all the facts. We need to have it figured out. We need to know exactly why. We have to be able to explain it. We have whole degrees about apologetics, right? And books after book about how you better know what you believe and why you believe it and how it works. And the scientific revolution did this for us in the Western world. And we destroyed what faith is because we think we can know something instead of what is the very definition of faith per the sacred text.
Believing in things you cannot see.
Believing in things you cannot see. And if we cannot see it, how can we possibly be able to define it out in such a black and white manner that we so that is just kind of I settled with that in here as well. Just the space of the entirety of the message of Jesus. Every time he healed, every time he walked, that he talked, everything that he did was about relational issues. It was about restoration. It was about reconciliation. It was about healing and resurrection. And it was about removing opportunities of harm from people's life so that they might have opportunity to continue relationship with one another. And this is all part of what it means to be human.
Yeah. And that's, and not to just bring it back to what other things I'm reading, but yeah, the I and thou, it's called I and thou because that's how Martin Buber describes that divine relationship with people, though. The idea that there are different relationships. There's the I, the I, we, the I, it, treating people as like a subject.
Yep.
Then there's the I, you, and there's the I, thou, you know.
And the thou puts the sacred into it.
Right.
Right? Just like, some people think that the King James language of thou is somehow more holy than whatever translation you're reading. But I love how he brings that word back in a sense of not so much thou as in God thou, but as in human thou, right? That space where we see the divine image of God in every single person, no matter who they are, where they are, what they've done, what we perceive of them, we see this divine image. And this is, think about how much life would have been easier for the woman who had to crawl on her feet to get to Jesus. If the people around him would have saw her as a thou, would she have ever needed to touch his garment to receive that healing? That healing was about the community, right? It was about the community accepting her, and not so much about what was going on inside of her body.
Right. They treated her like that it. The I, it, the I and the subject. What can I get from you? And if I can't get anything from you, then you are just an it. You're not even a you to be your relationship with.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's a I and Thou is a great read. I encourage people to read it. It's a little heavy.
I'll put a
short. Put
link
a
in the comments with the translation that I've referenced.
Yeah.
Because the preference is.
I mean, we could all read it in.
We could.
In
German.
In any other language.
Oh,
I couldn't read it if it was any other language. Not Spanish, not German, not Hebrew, not Greek.
Right.
None of them.
Now the preface goes in depth all about the translation, and it made me think about
Hebrew, nothing.
Right.
Nothing.
It made me think about just translational issues, because he talks about like, oh, you're not just getting the original thought, you're getting my thoughts as the translator doing it.
Yeah.
And so there was just some interesting thoughts then about like, because he goes on to talk about how Buber made his own German translation of the Hebrew texts.
Mm-hmm.
And so Buber and I'm going to forget the other gentleman's name who did the translation with him, but they didn't translate it into just a common vernacular. They translated it into, in my opinion, German is a very diverse language. Like, they just have words that take us a sentence to explain. My favorite being Schadenfreude, how do you say it?
What?
Schadenfreude. We had a teacher in high school.
Just making it up.
No,
I
it's
know
a word.
You're not, but
it's a word,
making
and so
up,
it means it's the feeling of like your enemy feeling pain, but then when you feel pain, it's a tragedy. So like tragedy is me getting a hangnail, comedy is you falling down a well and breaking a leg. Schadenfreude.
Okay.
Schadenfreude.
Yeah, so
There's a song about it in a musical.
Anywho, so language and translation, getting to my point, is that you can't just translate word for word. So that when it comes to things like the scriptures, very importantly, that we want to say is a good translation, when you have some words that need sentences to explain into English, and then sometimes you have the reverse when the translator is looking at a sentence like this, it just means one word in English.
Yeah.
And so then what do I keep? What do I get rid of?
Right. And that's why it's very hard to be a one translation woman or man. I assume that struggle's just as the same for both. But the that specific struggle.
Are you assuming my translation?
Yeah, our struggle with translating sacred texts, when we rely on one translation, we are missing, because that one translation is someone's interpretation of a sacred text, and so we have to be able to say, okay, how do we study the text in a way that does not bend us towards one understanding, one theological underpinning? Like, we have to be able, oftentimes you'll hear me talk about, well, this is the way one says it, one text says it, and one translation says it this way. But that's the beauty of translation, is that we need, even reading the text is a communal thing, and we need to hear what interpretations are out there. We need to hear what philosophers have to say, what theologians have to say. We need to hear what each and every person in our community has to say about how God has worked in their life. Because there are things there's commonalities every single time. But I also believe that being uniquely created in the image of God, how he speaks to me has its own intricacies. Just like how he speaks to you has its own unique values that maybe nobody else has ever experienced. Or at least nobody within your grasp, right? And so as we share our stories, and as we begin to, we're in a sense interpreting and continuing to translate, and even, shocker, continuing to write the story of God today.
It makes me think of, I'm awful, I can't remember where, I want to say in Genesis, where it talks about that God gave this portion of land at this time to this people, and I gave this portion of land to this time to this people. Not talking about the Israelites, but talking about like the descendants of Noah. And that just makes me think that God didn't just give them land in that time, but God interacted with them in that time in that way. And we have human culture, and for God to come down and to shine a bright light on something, like in my culture, if a being just showed up with brilliance of light, I'm like, oh my goodness, that must be like an angel, because that's how my culture has taught me angels look. If a creature showed up and it was hunched over and it was dark and menacing, I'm like, that's a demon, because that's how I've been taught demons to look. So for God to show himself to the people of earth over time, people of earth. So God interacting with people in their culture over time, in their lands, and giving it to them in the way that they can understand. Yeah.
So to believe that the only people who hold the sacred knowledge of a eternal creator God who cares about every single individual on the planet, to believe that Christians are the only people who hold any knowledge of that God is asinine.
The whole knowledge, or the
superior
knowledge.
Right. And the same is true. The same is true of any faith. To believe that the Jewish faith holds all of the exclusive knowledge, or that the Muslim faith holds all of it, or that Buddhist, like, there is a God who created. The story in our text tells us that he interacted with the entire world. And so all of us hold a piece of that knowledge somehow. And not any one of us hold all of it. And so to live in a space where we can honor and respect and learn from our brothers and sisters in different faiths is a good thing. I was struck today. So my I mean, you guys know, but other people listening don't know. Maybe my dad passed away this week, and this morning my daughter texted me, and I'll read you what she texted me, and maybe some would be offended because here I am, a person, a follower of Jesus, and I found great beauty and value in what she had to text me. And she says, I called her this morning to ask her if she was okay because she's a distance away, and she says, my religion professor said that Tibetan monks believe that after someone passes away, for the next 7 weeks, their soul is still around and active, and you can talk to them. And every 7 days, the connection is strong. He also said, you're supposed to talk to them and help them move on, because sometimes they don't realize they're dead, or they don't know how to move on from this life, or they just can't let go. And also to look for white moths or butterflies. And so I found extreme beauty in that, because we believe in eternal beings, right? Even within our faith, the reaction to that is when people have passed away. I've had people within the Christian faith tell me, well, that's ridiculous to talk to somebody who's dead. They're dead. Well, no, it's not. We believe in resurrection. We believe that there is life, right? To be absent in this world is to be present with Christ, which means there's got to be some kind of connection. But what I thought was beautiful in here is that every 7 days the connection is strong. So what is the seventh day in our faith tradition?
Sabbath.
It's the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And it's a day about family. It's a day about relationship. It's a day about connecting and reconnecting, and not just with God, but with those that are sacred to us, the thous in our lives. And so I think it's amazing that these Tibetan monks, right, mm-hmm. have this belief that on the seventh day there is this stronger connection to things eternal. Oh my goodness, right? Like, who can argue that they're wrong? Nobody can argue. I mean, go ahead and try to argue. I don't care. I'm not going to listen to you. But... You can argue, but if you sit back and you step back and you allow yourself to go, maybe I don't hold all the wisdom in the world. Maybe I don't hold all the wisdom about faith. Maybe Tibetan monks hold something that I don't. And they have a piece of my God that I don't yet understand. Mm-hmm. Your entire worldview begins to shift, and it doesn't shift away from God. It shifts more beautifully into God, and I think into the heart of what He desired in the garden, and into the heart of what He desires when He says, "My kingdom come." On this earth as it is in heaven, right?
That was one of the things that stood out to me in this reading, is this translation of that Lord's Prayer because it says, let your kingdom come now. And that word now on the end of there was like really powerful for me. Like, it's always just, this thing of your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, if we can figure it out, kind of feeling that I've always had about it. Just kind of like, we're trying to get there. We're, constantly seeking to get there, to bring kingdom to earth, but there's like that sense of urgency. Like, we want it now. We need it now. Because we long for it right now.
Yeah.
And it was just really
right. And even part of that is acknowledging that it's happening now.
And that it can, yeah.
Right? So the space, if anything, I guess get back to the very beginning, because we can't talk all night. But if anything about Christ's death and resurrection and what it means, maybe in that specific moment, the kingdom of God The full picture of what the kingdom of God could be was ushered in. That you could live completely human and you could die completely human. And there's something to be resurrected into a greater kingdom. And it happens now and it's in us. And there isn't any part of Jesus's life that wasn't kingdom saturated. And the same is true for us today when we choose to live into that. When we begin to say, I and thou, instead of I and that.
Get into the original German.
Yes.
I and it.
I and it. When we continue to say that there is something bigger than myself, there is something bigger than the black and white world that I've been handed, and I'm going to dive into the gray so that I might become more human, and in that become more divine. Make sense?
That's a good spot to wrap up because we're getting close to our time limit here.
Yeah.
So I'll put references down in the comments below to all of the books that we referenced so far. We talked about Buber. We talked about Weiss. We mentioned Kierkegaard. You mentioned Leonard Sweet. We mentioned Zizek for a hot second there. Am I missing
There
anybody?
was someone else she threw out at some random point, but I don't remember.
I don't remember who.
Who was it?
Right.
There was some Tibetan monks in there.
Right. It's
You
all
know,
good. I'll put
it's-
references
it's-
down at the bottom.
Yeah, we'll just put the references at the bottom, and you know, the beauty of this thing is that none of us are perfect, and so I hope at some point this conversation stirs something within our souls and does perhaps what Jesus came to do, which was to set the world on fire.